So my name is Chris Sare, and I'm going to present something today that I've been thinking about for a long time. And it was a 3-hour class, which I was told to condense down to an hour and a half. So I'll try to get at the most important, relevant points. Some details, but more conceptual. And if you think about what you just heard and what we're doing now, that this is the fulfillment of the American Revolution. This now spreading throughout the world is exactly what the United States was founded to create in the first place. And starting with Cusa, who wrote in 1433, hence, since natural law is based on reason, all law is rooted by nature in the reason of man. The wiser and more outstanding men are chosen as rulers by the others to draw up just laws by the clear reason, wisdom, and prudence given to them by nature, and to rule the others by these laws, and to decide controversies for the maintenance of peace. From this we conclude that those better endowed with reason are the natural lords and masters of the others, but not by any coercive law or judgment imposed on someone against his will. For since all are by nature free, every governance, whether it consists in a written law or in a living law in the person of a prince, can only come from the agreement and consent of the subjects. For if men are by nature equal in power and equally free, the true, properly ordered authority of one common ruler who is their equal in power, can only be constituted by the election and the consent of the others. And law is also established by consent. This is in 1433. Where was he going to create that idea? In Europe in 1433. It wasn't going to happen. He says, for those who live by the law are free, but true law is righteousness. True law is not carved on tablets nor cut in bronze, but stamped on the mind and imprinted on the senses. Now that's an important thing, because the evil of the empire is a philosophical evil. And the idea of, as Stephanie did a class a couple weeks back, where she went through this question of Leibniz versus Locke. And what Locke says in his essays on human understanding, see if I can, how do I go to the next slide? He says that the mind is a tabula rasa, that there's no principles governing, that basically what you know is what you experience. And what you experience is, like an animal, you seek pleasure, you avoid pain. Leibniz says quite the opposite. He says that there are principles that are established already in your soul, in your mind. And he says people that follow Locke, quote, will be capable for their pleasure or advancement of setting on fire the four corners of the earth. Boldly they scoff at the love of country. They ridicule those who care for the public. And when any well-meaning man speaks of what will become of posterity, they reply, we shall see when the time comes. But these persons will possibly experience themselves the evils they think reserved for others. If, however, this disease of an epidemic mind whose bad effects begin to be visible is corrected, these evils will perhaps be prevented. But if it goes on increasing, Providence will correct men by the revolution itself, which must spring therefrom. And that's the American Revolution. Now, I want to, I wish that I could, let's see here. There we go. This little county here, Westmoreland County, is an important little place. This is where George Washington was born. This is the area where Monroe comes from. This is where a lot of the founding fathers from Virginia come from. And at the time, when Alexander Spotswood was governor of Virginia, he was fighting against an oligarchical system. You had large plantations there, lots of slaves on these plantations, and an agricultural, turn that off, and an agricultural backwardness of plantation that was the British system that they had set up. Now what Spotswood did was he organized an iron industry in Germania. And he knew that in order for the colonies to become free, you would have to develop a manufacturing base, science, progress. He made Ben Franklin the postmaster of Philadelphia, for example. So there was a direct tie between Spotswood and Franklin. Franklin, in 1743, just to give you a sense of it, because this is, when you think of the founding fathers, and I'm going to get into this battle between those who were with the British system, even people who considered themselves patriots, or who you would consider to be a patriot, like Thomas Jefferson, for example. Say, oh, he was a patriot. In fact, many people really prize Jefferson because he's against the power of the government. He protects the states. He protects the little guy, he says. Now, in this pamphlet, A Proposal for Promoting Useful Knowledge Among the British Plantations in America, Franklin says, the first drudgery of settling new colonies which confines the attention of people to mere necessities are now pretty well over. And there are many in every province in circumstances that set them at ease and afford leisure to cultivate the finer arts and improve the common stock of knowledge. To such of these who are men of speculation, many hints must from time to time arise, many observations occur, which if well examined, pursued, and improved, might produce discoveries to the advantage of some or all of the British plantations, or to the benefit of mankind in general. 1743. We don't have a nation yet. That the subjects of the correspondence within this society that he creates be new and useful improvements in any branch of mathematics, new discoveries in chemistry, such as improvements in distillation, brewing, he was a big fan of beer, or assaying of ores, new mechanical inventions for saving labor, as mills and carriages, and for raising and conveying of water, draining of meadows, all new arts, trades, and manufactures that may be proposed or thought of, surveys, maps, and charts of particular parts of the seacoast or inland countries, course and junction of rivers and great roads, situation of lakes and mountains, nature of the soil and productions, new methods of improving the breed of useful animals, introducing other sorts from foreign countries, new improvements in planting, gardening, and clearing land, and all philosophical experiments that let light into the nature of things, tend to increase the power of man over matter and multiply the pleasures and conveniences of life. So he lays this all out in 1743. What will be the American system of political economy that develops? So, as a young man, George Washington was a surveyor. And he was a surveyor with a man named Thomas Marshall. And they worked actually on the Fairfax estate together. Lord Fairfax was a, I'm going to show you the whole idea of the northern neck of the Fairfax grant. And this is a whole story in and of itself, but Graham Lowry's book goes through this in great detail, that the idea of this Fairfax grant and the fight to recognize that it was the head of the springs of the Potomac and the Rappahannock rivers that represented the Fairfax estate, and that what this did was this put you on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. And so if you were interested in developing the interior of the United States, this was absolutely critical. And so Washington and Thomas Marshall, John Marshall's father, worked together on surveying this whole area, just to give you a sense of where John Marshall comes from. As a young man, John Marshall grew up around the Fairfax estate and had access to his entire library, including Jonathan Swift, all of these, and you know from Graham's book that these were the circles, these were the Leibnizian circles in Europe, that he didn't just come out of nowhere. You had James Monroe, who was born in the very same region. Now I'm going to look at both Marshall and Monroe very closely in the course of this class, because there's an irony, there's a huge irony if you look at the lives of these two men together, and you'll see what I mean. There's another man who's very important, Matthew Carey, who will become an important part of this story. And he's recruited by Benjamin Franklin. He's from Ireland. He's recruited by Benjamin Franklin in Europe to come to the United States. First he goes back to Ireland and he sets up Republican networks in Ireland against the British. But when it becomes unsafe, he comes to the United States. And he sets up shop in Philadelphia as a printer, very much like Ben Franklin himself. The whole issue of Europe and the oligarchical system and the philosophy behind, say, Locke was critical, so that the idea was to keep the United States and keep the colonies as a backward agrarian society, and to make sure that there was no industrial development whatsoever. Now, you had the Stamp Act in 1765. Franklin goes over to Europe and he fights he actually organizes England to repeal this. But in the meantime, Washington shifts his entire plantation away from tobacco, which was a cash crop that he would ship the tobacco over to Europe and get finished goods back from Europe. And at a certain point he realized this was, you kept getting worse and worse goods, a worse and worse price for the tobacco. So he shifts his entire plantation to producing wheat and corn and other goods, and then he sells these to bakeries in Alexandria. And when he becomes president later, he prides himself in wearing, everything he's wearing when he becomes president was made in the United States. Everything, down to his belt buckle. And so this gives you a sense of the difference between, for example, him and Thomas Jefferson, which we'll get to. James Monroe and I actually want to show you this. The 1763, the French and Indian War is over, and this is the proclamation line of 1763 that the British impose on the colonies. And so that's the line, and the colonies cannot go any further west than that. And what the Indian Reserve, that's what the British organize an Indian Reserve. They say, just this area is just going to be for the Indians, no development to the west. So if you're George Washington and you've been organizing the Ohio Company and you want to develop this whole area, this has now shut everything off. Now by 1770, Washington is organizing trips into this area anyway. he risks everything. He goes and does tours and looks at the question of canals and this kind of thing. The American Revolution intervenes in the meantime, and this is William and Mary College. This is where James Monroe used to do, starting in 1775, he did drills. He organized drills of the militia in Virginia, so that when George Washington became the commander-in-chief up in Boston, he was organizing, he and his father, Spence Monroe, and John Marshall, and his father, Thomas Marshall, they were organizing the regiments from Virginia to go up to Boston to join with General Washington. And these people, they fought in the Revolution. Monroe fought in the Revolution. Marshall fought in the Revolution. James Monroe was he was in the battle at Trenton. In fact, that's him. He was one of the only casualties in the Battle of Trenton. He was wounded gravely, and he survived. Yeah, he becomes president, so he's all right. But but it's so he fought. He was in it. John Marshall also was with General Washington in Valley Forge, and I'll just read to you. In the life of Washington, which Marshall writes, and we'll get to that, it's very important, but he says, at no period of the war had the situation of the American army been more perilous than at Valley Forge. Even when the troops were not entirely destitute of food, their stock of provisions was so scanty that a quantity of sufficient for 1 week was scarcely in store. The returns of the 1st of February 1778 exhibit the astonishing numbers of 3,989 men in camp unfit for duty for want of clothes. Scarcely one man of these had a pair of shoes. Even among those capable of doing duty, many were so badly clad that exposure to the cold of the season must have destroyed them. Although the total of the army included 17,000 men, the present effective rank and file amounted to only 5,012. Dysentery, all kinds of disease, starvation. Now imagine if you're Washington and you're thinking, on the basis of states' rights, these provisions are being denied to the soldiers that are fighting the revolution. On the basis of some states really just don't feel like it. They don't see the importance of it. Maybe we're not going to win. Maybe it's a fool's errand. So this is something to keep in mind in terms of Washington and Monroe and Marshall. All of these guys, they fought and they saw the lack of government directly. So this is Bushrod, Washington. At a certain point, in fact, this is important. At a certain point, there's no troops to command. There's not enough. I mean, Monroe and Marshall are at a certain level of military stature, lieutenants. But they need troops to command. There's no troops to command. So he goes to school. He goes back to William and Mary. He studies law. Monroe studies law with Thomas Jefferson. Marshall goes to Yorktown, planning to join the war again, but there's no troops to command. And he studies law with George Wythe. Bushrod, Washington is studying with him as well. This is the nephew of George Washington. Hamilton is with Washington at the Battle of Yorktown, and he leads the charge over the redoubts, and with the French moving in the French Navy. There's a pincher, and the British are crushed. And this is the last battle of the American Revolution. The peace isn't signed for a number of years, but Cornwallis surrenders right after that battle. Matthew Carey at this point moves to Paris. This is where Franklin recruits him, and he takes him into his printing office and trains him as an apprentice. Now, while all of this is going on, Thomas Jefferson is sitting at his plantation. He's the governor of Virginia, and he's on his plantation, and he's writing this book called Notes on the State of Virginia. And these are just a couple of sections from this. Such is our attachment to agriculture, and such is our preference for foreign manufactures, that be it wise or unwise, our people will certainly return as soon as they can to the raising of raw materials and exchange them for finer manufactures than they are able to execute themselves. This is his principle. Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breasts he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue. Of course, who's laboring? He says this, the natural progress and consequence of the arts has sometimes perhaps been retarded by accidental circumstance, but generally speaking, the proportion which the aggregate of the other classes of citizens bears in any state to its healthy part, and is a good enough barometer whereby to measure its degree of corruption. While we have land to labor, then, let us never wish to see our citizens occupied at a workbench or twirling a distaff. Carpenters, masons, smiths are wanting in husbandry, but for the general operations of manufacture, let our workshops remain in Europe. It is better to carry provisions and materials to workmen there than to bring them to the provisions and materials, and with them their manners and principles. The loss by transportation of commodities across the Atlantic will be made up in happiness and permanence of governments. The mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government as sores do to the strength of the human body.
This is Jefferson.
This is Jefferson, yeah. It's from his book called Notes on the State of Virginia, which he writes in 1780, right in the middle of, right while everyone else is fighting. He's pontificating on his great principles, which are, wouldn't it be better if we were still plantation, a British plantation. And then it's also in this book where he argues, and I'm not going to go through the notes, the quotes, but he argues the absolute inferiority of Africans, and it's disgusting. So.
In the same notes on.
In the same notes on Virginia, yeah. Yeah, he says they're not capable of reason.
Okay.
So that's Jefferson. Now you have this is the Treaty of Ghent, the Treaty of Paris. Treaty against later, and so the treaty is organized. There's Ben Franklin there and others, and actually the British that signed on to the treaty, they didn't want to be in the picture, so the painting was never finished. But at this point, George Washington writes to Alexander Hamilton, because the war is over. We've won our independence. He says, my wish to see the union of these states established upon liberal and permanent principles, an inclination to waning contribute my might in pointing out the defects of the mark on present Constitution are equally great. The Articles of Confederation. He says, I shall oblige to you, however, for the thoughts which you have promised me on this subject as soon as you can make it convenient. No man in the United States is or can be more deeply impressed with the necessity of a reform in our present Confederation than myself. No man perhaps has felt the bad effects of it more sensibly For to the defects thereof and want of power in Congress may justly be ascribed the prolongation of the war. He says to Lafayette 5 days later, we are now an independent people. We have yet to learn political tactics. We are placed among the nations of the earth and have a character to establish, but how shall we acquit ourselves? Time must discover. How we shall acquit ourselves, time must discover. The probability is, at least I fear it, that local or state politics will interfere too much with the more liberal and extensive plan of government, which wisdom and foresight, freed from the mind of prejudice, would dictate, and that we shall be guilty of many blunders in treading this boundless theater. So he's very concerned that we create a federal government, a strong federal government. This is Washington. Marshall also writes letters at the same exact time with his same concerns. So Washington, who could have become king, surrenders, he resigns his commission as the general and goes back to his farm. And this is the Washington family with you can see the Potomac in the background there. And the Potomac was very, very important to Washington. And in 1785, he becomes the head of the Potomac Canal Corporation. Because before you have the Constitution, he organizes this canal corporation to develop a canal on the Potomac. And one of the interesting things is that I'll get to this in a second. But when the Congress, which James Monroe is now elected to the Congress, Jefferson and others, they're representatives to the Congress. Congress moves to Annapolis, Maryland, and it's there where there's a discussion because Maryland and Virginia are fighting over the rights of the Potomac. Who's going to get the canal? Who's going to get the benefits from the canal? And Washington says, this is insane. We just fought the revolution. We're now a nation, and you guys are going to fight about that. So in 1786, Hamilton organizes a move in Annapolis. It's called a meeting of commissioners to remedy defects of the federal government. And in this case, only 5 states showed up, 5 out of the 13 colonies: New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia. But it was here where they agreed that they would unite the next year in Philadelphia to organize the Constitutional Convention. So this is where the seeds of it come from. So Lafayette, who's here, he visits Washington during this period in Mount Vernon, and Matthew Carey arrives in Philadelphia, and Lafayette gives him $400 to set up a publishing business. So these are the networks that Franklin and Washington have created. Well, we'll get to this in a second. You have the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention. It starts in May of 1787. Ben Franklin's there, Hamilton, Washington, and all these various people from the states. They come, and they basically create this entirely new Constitution. They're there under the guise of reforming it, but everybody there knows, especially Washington, that it's got to be completely reorganized. Otherwise, it won't work. So you have 32 delegates at the convention sign the Constitution on September 17th. I just want to read for you the preamble, just to keep in your mind, because this is the most important thing. The rest of the details are important, but the operating principle of the Constitution is this: we, the people, not the states, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Washington says, I wish the Constitution had been more perfect, but I believe it is the best that could be obtained at this time. And as a constitutional door is open for amendments hereafter, the adoption of it is, in my opinion, desirable. So, and Ben Franklin says something similar. I don't know that it's the best Constitution that we could have created, but I don't know that it isn't. It may be the best Constitution that we could have created. So let's do it. And this is where Marshall kicks in. Now, this is interesting because Monroe is organized. Jefferson's not even there. Jefferson's in France. Monroe is organized by the Jeffersonians against the Constitution. He says it's too much power. So Monroe votes against the Constitution. Marshall argues for the Constitution, and he says, what are the objects of national government? To protect the United States and to promote the general welfare. The object of our inquiry is the power necessary and is it guarded? And he argues, he said, if they were to make a law, they being the Congress, were to make a law not warranted by any of the powers enumerated, it would be considered by the judges as an infringement of the Constitution, which they are to guard. They would not consider such a law as coming under their jurisdiction. They would declare it void. What is the purpose of the judiciary? To execute the laws in a peaceable, orderly manner without shedding blood or availing yourselves of force. If this be the case, where can its jurisdiction be more necessary than here? To what quarter will you look for protection from any infringement on the Constitution if you will not give the power to the judiciary? There is no other body that can afford such protection. So he organizes the checks and balances within the Constitution. He argues for this, and this will become very important later in terms of Marshall's role. But so the Constitution is ratified by Virginia, and Washington becomes president. He has a wild variety of people in his administration. He has Alexander Hamilton as his Treasury Secretary. He has Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State. He has Edmund Randolph as his Attorney General. And the immediate questions are, what are we going to have? What will give the government the power that it needs to do what it needs to do to promote the general welfare of the nation? So Hamilton, who's been thinking about this all throughout the Revolution, he says, well, we need credit. We need public credit. We can't be reliant on outside banking interests or outside European forces for credit. We need public credit. So he writes a first report on public credit. And he argues for this idea of public credit, and the idea is to assume the debts. It's called assumption. Assume the debts of all the states into one, and then use those debts as a means to issue new credit for internal improvements in the nation. So all of a sudden, Madison turns against this. Madison, who had argued for the Constitution, Madison, who had actually played a role in getting the Constitution through in Virginia, he said, I'm going to introduce a Bill of Rights. So if anybody is afraid that you won't have certain rights, I will introduce a Bill of Rights. And he did, and the Bill of Rights passed, right? The first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights. All of a sudden, Madison turns against this. And this is this states' rights garbage, which is being brought in by the enemy. And even people that were for it, that were for this kind of power, are now being
Swayed.
Yeah, swayed. And a lot of it is because of this, what Jefferson goes through is the way of life in the South. All right? We have our plantations, we have our way of doing things. We don't like this big government stuff. We don't. Nope. And it gets very. You'll see. They become very clear on this, what the issue is. Now, what happens is, this is very funny. In the debate over the question of the national bank, there's a gentleman named Boudinot, who's a friend of Madison's, Elias Boudinot. He reads from the Federalist Papers Madison's own words. Of the first is quote, the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or office thereof. So this is from the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. Few parts of the Constitution have been assailed with more intemperance than this. Yet on a fair investigation of it, no part can appear more completely invulnerable. Without the substance of this power, the whole Constitution would be a dead letter, he says. Those who object to the article, therefore, as a part of the Constitution can only mean that the form of the provision is improper, but have they considered whether a better form could have been substituted? Had the Constitution been silent on this head, there can be no doubt that all the particular powers requisite as means of executing the general powers would have resulted to the government by unavoidable implication. No axiom is more clearly established in law or in reason than that whenever the end is required, the means are authorized. So if the end is constitutional, then the means to the end are also constitutional. Whenever a general power to do a thing is given, every particular power necessary for doing it is included. It would be like you say, well, to establish post roads and deliver mail, but you can't have a vehicle to do it, because it doesn't say in the Constitution you can't have a vehicle to do it. So if it doesn't say it, then you can't do it, right? And we didn't have airplanes then, so we move mail by airplane now. It doesn't say in the Constitution you can do that, so according to Jefferson, you couldn't, because it's a strict interpretation of the Constitution, not the essence of the Constitution and the idea of the general welfare and the necessary and proper clause. And this becomes a real critical point. Jefferson argues completely against this to Washington. He says, unless it's in there, and he says, furthermore, I mean, basically what Madison and Jefferson begin to argue is that George Washington is becoming like a king. And that's that he wants to make himself king. So Washington, of course, is completely furious at this, because if anybody ever had a chance to become king, he could have done it, and rejected becoming president of the United States until they demanded he become president of the United States. He was the only one that could do it. He did it. He came back. He would have preferred to stay on his farm. So this is the first faction. This is the first faction inside the United States that you really see, and Jefferson is creating this. Jefferson is insisting on this. Hamilton writes in his report on manufactures that once the national bank is established, and Hamilton argues this same, really very much like what Madison says, is that if it's a constitutional question, like coining money, regulating the value thereof, as the Constitution says, then if a bank is the most efficient way to do it, to issue currency, so you don't have all the different states issuing different currencies, you don't know what the value of these currencies are, squabbling fights between states, then it doesn't have to be absolutely necessary, it just has to be necessary. And Washington agrees. And Washington signs the National Bank into law February 25th, 1791. So there's an operation to attack Washington. There's this guy named Philip Freneau who's brought into Philadelphia to run a newspaper called the National Gazette. And Jefferson and Madison basically organized his paycheck. Now at the same time, while all this is going on over in France, you have the French Revolution. Now, everybody, including Washington, what Federalist, Democratic, Republican, these parties didn't really exist yet. Everybody hoped that the French Revolution would work in terms of a model being modeled in the United States. But once it became clear that Lord Shelburne and British intelligence services were not going to let that happen, that they were going to instead go for a bloodbath in France against any kind of reasonable Republican government, then Washington began to get very, very concerned about this. And he even writes a letter to Lafayette warning, you know, I'm very concerned about the turn of events over there. The founding fathers were as afraid of mob rule and chaos as they were of dictatorship. Because, of course, as you see in France later, the mob rule and chaos leads to dictatorship under Napoleon. Exactly what they were afraid of. At this point,
Sabotage.
yeah, Hamilton is organizing for, he writes a report on the subject of manufacturers. So he gets right at Jefferson here. And he says that the spirit of enterprise, useful and prolific as it is, must necessarily be contracted or expanded in proportion to the simplicity and variety of the occupations and productions which are to be found in a society. It must be less in a nation of mere cultivators than in a nation of cultivators and merchants. Less in a nation of cultivators and merchants than a nation of cultivators, artificers, and merchants. So he argues for manufacturing, and he says that the part of the importance of manufacturing is, quote, to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise. It's not the least among the considerable expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. So he's thinking about the mind. Again, this question of your view of mankind, going back to Cusa, going back to Leibniz versus Locke, your view of mankind. Are you a beast out on the field, or are you a human being with a mind? And you're going to develop that. So this is a fundamental difference between Jefferson and Hamilton. Now, let me see if I can find this. Jefferson is so opposed to the new national bank that he argues against Governor Henry Lee of Virginia even setting up a state bank to compete against the national bank. Because he says by setting up, and Hamilton had argued, he said, look, there's nothing in the Constitution that says a state can't have a bank. So you can have banks, but we want a national bank. That's first and foremost, we want a national bank. Jefferson writes later, a year later, the power of erecting banks and corporations was not given to the general government. It remains then with the state itself. For any person to recognize a foreign legislature, talking about the U.S. Congress, a foreign legislature is a case belonging to the state itself, in a case belonging to the state itself, is an act of treason against the state. And whoever shall do any act under color of the authority of a foreign legislature, our Congress, whether by signing notes, issuing or passing them, acting as director, cashier, or in any other office relating to it, shall be adjudged guilty of high treason and suffer death accordingly by the judgment of the state courts. This is the only opposition worthy of our state and the only kind which can be effectual. I really wish that this or nothing should be done. So that's Jefferson. So, is he a traitor?
Yes.
It seems like it, you know. Is he just totally indoctrinated in a certain philosophy? Maybe, but he functions as a traitor. Now Monroe, what happens is Monroe, who is in love with the French Revolution, he is in a real quandary. When Marshall organizes a meeting in Richmond to defend George Washington's idea of neutrality, because Washington has a policy of neutrality towards European powers. Now, he understood, if you get involved in European politics, just like Cusa understood, you are in serious trouble, because you are going to be played by those powers, and the powers of Europe don't like our republic. They don't want to see us survive. So whoever you think is your friend, I mean, because Lafayette didn't win in France. The nuts won, and then Napoleon won. So this was an important point. And Monroe actually writes he writes under a pseudonym attacking this meeting organized by Marshall, and George Wythe, who was a Republican, who was a friend of Jefferson's, came to the meeting and agreed, yes, Washington's principle is correct. So Monroe, Marshall's old friend, accuses him of harboring pro-British sentiments, right? Because if you're not with the revolution, then you're with the British. That's the line of reasoning. That's how the factions are organized. Now, in 1793, Citizen Edmond Genet arrives in the United States, Citizen Genet, from the French Revolution. And he threatens a coup against George Washington. And he's organizing, because Washington doesn't support the Jacobins in France. So he's running around the United States, and Jefferson is helping him. Jefferson is helping to set up, quote unquote, democratic clubs to support Genet. In fact, Jefferson brings a copy of the newspaper, the National Gazette, Philip Freneau's paper, which has a cartoon of George Washington wearing a crown, having his head chopped off in the guillotine. This is Jefferson, his Secretary of State. So Washington erupts and just says, look, I have no desire to be king, period. You know that better than anybody else. This is an outrage. And he's very, very distraught about this factionalization going on within his administration. Now this is interesting, because Monroe is sent by Washington to France in August of 1794. And he's sent there to organize for Washington's principle of friendship with all, right? So Monroe is sent to France. He's a Francophile. John Jay is sent to England, and he's considered to be an Anglophile. This is all, that's how the factions see it. So when Monroe and his whole family arrive in France, all of a sudden they have to face the bloodbath that's going on in France. They see it. In fact, Robespierre had just been guillotined 5 days earlier, because Robespierre was no longer a darling of the mobs, even though he had led the mobs earlier. And so he was guillotined. And who's in jail, waiting to be murdered? First of all, there's thousands of people waiting to be executed by the guillotine. Thousands of people in prison. One of them is Adrienne de Lafayette, the wife of Lafayette. Lafayette had already escaped, basically tried to escape, but then he was captured in Austria and put in prison, which is what the whole Fidelio opera is about. But Adrienne de Lafayette is in prison. Elizabeth Monroe goes to the prison and organizes her release, James Monroe's wife. She personally goes and organizes her release. And then Monroe organizes an American passport for her son, George Washington Lafayette, named after, of course, George Washington. So he sees the reality of the situation. And when at the same time, you have Washington give his farewell address. He warns about factions. He warns about party. This is one of the deepest troubling things on his mind, is this question of faction and party. Monroe comes back to Philadelphia. John Adams had in between won the election. Adams is he's a party man. He is with the Federalist Party. It's the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans now. And he beats Thomas Jefferson, but now Jefferson becomes the vice president, and that obviously that's like a nightmare world of party politics within the administration. So Monroe comes back to Philadelphia, and he just says, look, forget it. I'm going back to Virginia. He becomes governor. And as governor, his primary focus is on internal improvements in the state of Virginia. He's thinking in terms of, like Washington, how do we get canals, how do we get roads west within the state of Virginia? George Washington who's concerned about this, says to Marshall, tells Marshall that he needs to run for Congress. And I just want to read you a section because it's very, because of course if you know that Washington was always dragging himself out of retirement to serve the nation, it'd be hard to say no to Washington. Bushrod from Westmoreland County, where the Washington family had its roots, and Marshall from the district of Richmond and Henrico County. Both seats were held by Republicans, and the old chief recognized that men of considerable stature would be required to dislodge them. General Washington urged the importance of this crisis. Every man who could contribute to the success of sound opinion was required by the most sacred duty to offer his services to the public. And I would ask you to think that Washington is not looking at this from the standpoint of party, of the Federalist Party. He's saying that there's these particularly radical Republicans, and Richmond becomes a nest of this. We've got to reorganize to defend the basic constitutional principles that we're founded on. It's not a question of party. Bushrod Washington, confronted by his uncle's peremptory command of "Bushrod, it must be done," soon acquiesced. Marshall, however, remained firm in his determination to return to his practice. Any good that he could do, he had already promised his support to another candidate, and that he needed his income as a lawyer to pay for the remainder of the Fairfax estate. I told him I had made large pecuniary engagements which require close attention, etc., etc. Washington was unrelenting. That evening after the banquet, he gave Marshall a stern directive to run for office. Marshall hesitated to take offense at Washington's manner, and his respect for the aged general prevented him from replying sharply, but his resolve was unshaken. For 3 days, the two men had engaged in a fierce battle of wills. It was a rare experience for Washington to have his wishes rejected so openly, but Marshall felt strongly his first responsibility was to his family. In deference to Washington, Marshall decided to rise before dawn and ride out from Mount Vernon before the argument could be renewed. It may have been an intervention of fate, but the former president anticipated Marshall's intent. At first light, when Marshall opened the front door and stepped out of the piazza to make his way to the stable, Washington was waiting for him. Some reports have it that he was dressed once again in his uniform as a lieutenant general and commander-in-chief. Whether this was the case or not, Washington was determined to make a final plea. Many years later, Marshall wrote, "The conversation that morning was one of the most interesting I was ever engaged in." And the former president made a personal appeal based on his own example. He had withdrawn from office with the declaration of his determination never again, under any circumstances, to enter public life. No man could be more sincere in that declaration, nor could any man feel stronger motives for adhering to it. No man could make a stronger sacrifice than he did in breaking that resolution, thus publicly made, and when he had believed it, and which he believed to be unalterable. Yet I saw him in opposition to his public declaration, in opposition to his private feelings, consenting under a sense of duty to surrender the sweets of retirement, and again to enter the most arduous and perilous station which an individual could fill. My resolution yielded to this representation, and I became a candidate for Congress.
Wow.
Now,
That's cool.
yeah, it's great. And what he does, now this is Marshall, he's a Federalist, right? He says, if I'm elected, I will reject the Alien and Sedition Acts. This was the Alien and Sedition Acts were the hardcore Federalists and John Adams, they pushed this through. And basically, if you said anything against the government, you could be arrested, you could be fined, you could be put in jail. And Marshall said, I will not go along with that as a Federalist. I will not go along with that. And in fact, when he was elected, he stood by his pledge, and he was the deciding vote. It was 48 to 50 because of his vote against the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so, had it been tied, then the vice president would have, I guess somebody would have intervened, and it would have gone that way. So he, just to give you a sense, this guy had principle. You know, John Marshall had tremendous principle. He stood with his convictions, not his party. Hamilton had his principles too. And in the election of 1800, where Adams and the Federalists lost, and Jefferson and Burr, Aaron Burr, had equal votes, 73 votes each. Hamilton organizes Bayard, James Bayard of Delaware, to make the deciding non-vote. He takes his vote back from Burr, who's being groomed by the radical Federalists to champion. Now Burr is a treasonous bastard, and is being organized by the people in the North, the Federalists in the North, who want to secede from the Union. And we'll get to that. There's a whole gang of Federalists who want to break up the Union. And so Burr is defeated, and Hamilton basically says, look, Jefferson, he said, I'd rather have somebody who's wrong about their principles than somebody who has no principles at all. And so he organizes for Jefferson's election. This is Hamilton organizing for Jefferson's election. I mean, imagine this, right? Nobody could have been fighting more during the Washington administration than these two. So this is really phenomenal. Now, one of Adams' last acts as president is he signs Marshall in as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now this is interesting because, of course, Marshall had voted against the Alien Sedition Act of Adams. But Adams recognized something in Marshall that was really tremendous, and he made him the Chief Justice of the United States. Now the first thing that Marshall wanted to do was to crush party politics in the Supreme Court. He said, you can't have a court run by party politics. You can't have a court playing favor. We're in power now, right? What happens when we're not in power? What then? So, first thing he does is he wears a black robe. And the idea of the black robe is that he's not, because in England, I guess, they would wear different color robes depending on what party they're in the courts. So he wears a black robe, and he requests that everybody else on the court also wear a black robe. And this is really interesting. During the next 4 years, so this is 1801 that he becomes the Chief Justice. In the next 4 years, Marshall would speak for the court. Now this was an interesting thing in and of itself, that you had the Chief Justice speak for the whole court. In 42 of the 46 cases that he was in, because he recused himself in four cases. A lot of the stuff around the Fairfax estate he would recuse himself from because he had personal interest in it. All 46 were unanimous. All 46 decisions of the Supreme Court were unanimous. And that was how he organized this court around principles that were so irrefutable that they were unanimous. Okay. You can say, well, they all came from the same party. They were all justices from Washington and Adams. Okay. Jefferson takes office in March 1st of 1801. Madison becomes his Secretary of State. Monroe wins a passage to build a road between the highest navigable points of the James and Kanawha rivers to unite by a strong bond of interest our western brethren with those on the Atlantic. This is in the Virginia General Assembly. He's the governor. Jefferson writes to Monroe that he must go to France for an extraordinary mission. And they feared that Spain was going to cede the Louisiana territory to France. Now, the truth was that they had already done that. They had already ceded it in 1800. So France already had the Louisiana territory from the Spanish.
Louisiana's French.
So this is something that's dear to Monroe's heart, right? He wants to develop the West like Washington did. And so he goes over. Talleyrand, the foreign minister of France, and this guy Talleyrand is really, he's a really remarkable piece of crap, because he's in all the governments in France. He's in when the Jacobins are there. He's in when Napoleon is there. I mean, this guy can change his color like you can't imagine, right? So he is one slippery creature. He has told Spain that unless Spain could keep the vermin out, unless they had the power to do it, then they had better cede the area to France, which they did, because France could turn the Appalachians into, quote, a wall of brass forever impenetrable to the combined efforts of England and America. So now it's not the British that want to keep the United States out, it's the French. So this is important in terms of Washington's view on you can't trust any of these European powers, right? Napoleon plans to use Jefferson as a useful tool as president, because he's a Francophile, to let the French do whatever they wanted, planning on sending 20,000 troops to occupy the territory. Jefferson and Madison threaten war, but give Monroe the option to purchase Louisiana to avoid it. So even Jefferson wakes up and realizes he's been had by the French. So Monroe is over there, and he's given the right to appropriate up to $9 million for New Orleans and Florida. And Madison, who's the Secretary of State, tells Monroe, you are under instruction to tell the French that if they don't want to negotiate, then we will join the British. It's Jefferson, right? We will join the British against you. So Monroe goes to London to try to to try to get this territory, rather. To Paris. I skipped here. Sorry about that. He goes to France. Congress gives him this authorization. And basically what happens is, let me see if I have in the meantime, there's, that's not bad, huh? In the meantime, there's a slave revolt in one of the French territories, and Napoleon says, "Damn these colonies! I don't want any part of it." Very fortuitous. So they agree to sell all of Louisiana for $15 million. So instead of just New Orleans and Florida, they get all of Louisiana for $15 million. Now, Monroe hasn't been authorized to buy this for $15 million, but he does it.
How much money did he have to?
$9 million. $9 million, yeah. Up to $9 million. They were hoping for less. But so now, right around the same time, well, let me just finish this thought, because Monroe was then sent to London to stop the impressment of our sailors, yeah, of our Navy, and so he's beginning. I mean, this is where he's beginning to see that the French are treacherous, the British are treacherous. He's beginning to come to Washington's point of view.
Jefferson, you're talking about?
No, Monroe, who's first sent by Jefferson, and right. He's
with Jefferson. Then you start to see.
He starts to see that Washington has some sense here, that you don't have these alliances with, you want neutrality. You want neutrality. So, February 24th, the Supreme Court, under Marshall, rules in Marbury versus Madison. And there's not the time to go through all the details on Marbury versus Madison. But the essential important thing about Marbury versus Madison is that Marshall rules that a law that Congress passed is unconstitutional. There's Adams appoints circuit judges before he leaves the White House. They're delivered by the Secretary of State, who's John Marshall at the time, who was the Secretary of State for like 2 months at the end of the Adams administration. They're delivered. They're left on the table. Jefferson and Madison basically don't even recognize them, even though they had been signed. So this is a contention. These judges are saying, hey, we were duly appointed by Adams. He was still president. We want our seats. And so they go to Madison and they say, where are the papers? He says, I don't know. I have no idea. And so Marshall, in hearing this case, he says, well, first we have to decide, do we even have jurisdiction over this? Is the law under which we are trying this case, which was the Judiciary Act of 1798, is this even constitutional? And so he figures a way out, in a sense, that the law is not constitutional because there wasn't a series of appeals. They took this case right to the Supreme Court without them being the appeal court. And so he said, that's unconstitutional. We have no writ of mandamus. We can't force any decision that we make. It was an unconstitutional law. So this is the first time that the Supreme Court rules that a law is unconstitutional. And it's totally fascinating. Let me just read you this thing. He says, could a law that was unconstitutional be enforced by the courts? According to Marshall, the question was deeply interesting, but happily not of an intricacy proportional to its interest. The people of the United States had established the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. It organizes the government and assigns to different departments their respective powers. To what purpose are the powers limited, and to what purpose is that limitation committed to writing? If these limits may at any time be exceeded by those intended to be restrained, it is a proposition too plain to be contested that the Constitution controls any legislative act repugnant to it. Otherwise, the legislature may alter the Constitution at will. Quote, between these alternatives, there is no middle ground. The Constitution is either a superior, paramount law, unchangeable by ordinary means, just by Congress passing a law against against something in the Constitution, right? You can amend the Constitution, but it's a much higher threshold that you have to reach to amend the Constitution. Or is on the level with ordinary legislative acts, and like other acts is alterable. The Constitution is alterable whenever the legislature shall please to alter it. So Jefferson is furious. He says, how dare this guy say that a law is unconstitutional? It's the will of the people. The Congress represents the will of the people. That's his view. Now this is interesting. 1804. How am I doing? 15 more minutes. See what we can do. 1804. I'm going to wind it up, but this we're getting here. 1804. Jefferson appoints William Johnson of South Carolina to the Supreme Court because there's a resignation. So this is the first appointment by a Republican on the Supreme Court. And Jefferson appoints William Johnson because he is sure that this guy is a states' rights kindred spirit. Monroe, in the meantime, is sent to Spain to try to get the Floridas as part of the deal, because the French had assured him that the Floridas were part of the whole territory. The French tell him, "Nope, we're not gonna say anything. We don't agree. We don't agree." And so Monroe is totally double-crossed by the French again, and is furious. And while he's there, Napoleon crowns himself emperor because the Pope wouldn't put the crown on him. That went too far. But he did bring Pope Pius VII into France to be by his side as he crowned himself emperor. So Monroe goes to Spain. He's unable to get the Floridas. Goes back to London. The Leopard, which is a British man of war, attacks the Chesapeake in 1807, and so this is and grabs 4 Navy men that they say are deserters, and I think they hang them. So they don't even keep them as sailors; they just hang them. And this is such an outrage. This is the kind of thing that's going on, and thousands of our sailors are being impressed by both the British and the French, because they're saying, if you won't take sides in this, if you won't be with either of us, then we'll both impress your sailors. With the French, because the sailors didn't speak French, they mostly put them in jail, and it was a hell, to be in these French jails.
The French and the British are fighting a war at this time.
Yeah, sorry. The French and the British are at war.
Each other.
I mean, this is the critical war, right? Napoleon
Okay.
and the British. So this is a big one, and it's going on, and it has relevance to the War of 1812, as you'll see. So basically, in 1810, you have Henry Clay. He gets elected. He becomes the Speaker of the House. He's from Kentucky. He's from the West. He's not North or South anymore. It's a whole different group of people that are now being elected. And Clay represents this idea of the nationalists, building the nation, internal improvements. And he sees under Jefferson that our entire Navy had been taken down by Gallatin, who was the Treasury Secretary. He said, we don't need a Navy, we just need to pay the debt. Gallatin took down our Navy. Our sailors are being impressed, and we have a collapsing Navy. So Clay comes in, he says, look, we need war with Britain. We've got to build up our manufacturing. We've got to rebuild our Navy. And right at this point, the National Bank Charter 1811 expires. So the first National Bank expires. So you have chaos, economic chaos, states now going into printing their own currency, etc. So you have this going on. 1812, war is declared on Britain by Madison, but basically they put it to him. They said, listen, if we will support you for re-election, you have to go to war with England, and he does. John Marshall opposes the war, but he's quiet. Monroe sends him documents supporting it. Monroe sends Marshall documents supporting why we're going to war, and Marshall keeps the Supreme Court out of the debate. And as the war starts, Marshall becomes he's certainly in favor of us winning. William Eustis, the Secretary of the War, who was a Secretary of War under Jefferson, who was a confidant of Aaron Burr, did not support the war, and he's Secretary of Defense. So what happens is the opening battle, Hull up here doesn't even know that war has begun, but the British know war has begun, and they surround the fort with Indians and British forces. This guy Brock, and he surrenders without a shot fired, recognizing that they're gonna be butchered if they fight. And you have a series of defeats in the first 6 months all along this area. And the question is treason involved? Is Eustis sabotaging this? He puts this guy Wilkinson in charge of one of the attacks, who who was allied with Burr in the whole plot to break off the West, which is a whole other story that I wasn't able to go into. But so Hull surrenders Fort Detroit. William Eustis, on January 13th, 1813, resigns as Secretary of War. Madison nominates Monroe, who was his Secretary of State, to also be Secretary of War. But there's an outrage by the Federalists, the High Federalists, Josiah Quincy, saying this is just too much power, and he organizes. Now, this is Josiah Quincy is the guy who's organizing for the separation of New England. He's with the Essex Junto, who are planning the ripping apart of the nation. So in this brief period of time, Monroe reorganizes the whole military because he's acting Secretary of War until Madison can get a new Secretary of War. So in a few weeks, he reorganizes the entire army into a real fighting force. And General John Armstrong becomes Secretary of War, who was a very bad decision on the part of Madison. He was involved in the intrigues against George Washington when Washington was the general. So General Dearborn organizes 1,600 patriots, replacing New York militiamen who didn't want to fight because it was more like a states' right thing. Why are we fighting in this war? We don't even agree with it. He organizes 1,600 patriots. They join forces with Winfield Scott, who's later on a hero in the War of 1848, and then later on in the Civil War. 2,500 troops, and they retake all the territory that was lost. They take back Fort Niagara, Fort Erie, Buffalo's Black Rock Navy Yard. They free 5 ships. Secretary of Navy William Jones had 6 more ships. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry wins a 3-hour battle on Lake Erie with these ships against the British. He says, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." We regain the control of the lake of General William Henry Harrison, later on who becomes president, then routs the British and Indian forces on the Thames in Canada. And Monroe organized, what Monroe had organized was basically we were going to take Montreal. We were going to take Canada. We were going to crush the British Empire once and for all. Armstrong then sacks all of these generals, replaces Dearborn with Wilkinson. Wilkinson is on the way up to Montreal. He's a drunk. The story is he's bragging. He's overheard by British spies, and the move to capture Montreal is blown. By the end of 1813, the West is largely retaken by the British as well. So then, this is the good part. I'm going to try. So Monroe is saying, look, the war between the British and the French are now over. Napoleon's defeated. So all of a sudden, 14,000 British troops are freed up to come over to the United States. It's not looking good. Captain Thomas McDonough repels 11,000 of these troops on Lake Champlain with 14 ships. Lake Champlain, Battle of Plattsburgh. At the same time, they land 4,000 troops on the shore of the Patuxent River, which is in the Chesapeake Bay, right? Monroe sounds the alarm. Monroe's Secretary of State. He's not Secretary of Defense. He sounds the alarm. Armstrong does nothing. Armstrong says they're not going to attack the capital. Madison names Secretary. Of course, we know they do attack, right? Monroe single-handedly just rallies the forces, like in a similar way, the way that George Washington rallied forces in the American Revolution numerous times. Just say, where are you retreating to? Let's go. Monroe organizes the troops to fight, and then as the troops leave the burnt capital and they move up towards Baltimore, right? Monroe organizes. He's made Secretary of Defense by Madison. It's an order. Armstrong is relieved at this point. He has almost dictatorial power at this point, Monroe, because we're about to lose the whole country. So he goes up and he organizes all of the defenses of Baltimore and Washington. And of course, on September 14th, 1812, the flag is still there, as we know from that. Right? Star Spangled Banner. Right? It's a battle all night, but our defenses win. The British sail out of the Chesapeake. So we win, we win. And meanwhile, John Quincy Adams is organizing the Treaty of Ghent with the British. And so this is a critical turning point. Matthew Carey then writes this book called The Olive Branch, where he blasts the parties, and he goes after both parties. He says everybody involved has played a treacherous role when they're thinking in terms of party. And this is what has brought us to this point. The Second National Bank of the United States is rechartered under Madison in 1816, February of 1816. Monroe runs against Senator Rufus King, who's a Federalist from New York, who was apparently pro-War of 1812, unlike a lot of the Federalists. But Monroe defeats him easily, 183 to 34. John Marshall administers James Monroe's oath of office. And Monroe gives his inauguration speech, which is absolutely beautiful, and it's all against party. He says, his list of priorities as president are unifying the nation, strengthening the nation's defenses, and expanding the economy with programs to encourage road and canal construction, manufacturing, and agriculture. Possessing as we do all the raw materials, the fruit of our own soil and industry, we ought not to depend in the degree we have done on supplies from other countries. The capital which nourishes our manufactures should be domestic, the capital. Our coast and inland frontiers should be fortified, our army and navy be kept in perfect order, and our militia be placed on the best practicable footing. He pledged to put our extensive coast in such a state of defense as to secure our cities and interior from invasion. National honor is national property of the highest value. It ought therefore to be cherished. Discord does not belong to our system. The American people constitute one great family with a common interest. So what he does is he then he takes a tour, as Washington had done. He takes a tour of all the states, and he gets to know all the people of the states. And he goes with Joseph Gardner Swift, who was the Army's chief engineer and superintendent of West Point. So they actually go and they look at the fortifications. They decide what kind of forts they're going to build, etc. So this is what Monroe does. And in 1818, you have the first 130 miles of the national road built between Cumberland, Maryland, and Wheeling, Virginia, two different states. This had been blocked by the Jeffersonian Republicans, but Marshall's Supreme Court decisions affirm the right of Congress to pass any law it deems necessary and proper for executing its constitutional powers. So Monroe and Marshall are working together to reassert this original principle that Washington understood. The first 15 miles of the Erie Canal are opened in 1818 between Utica and Rome, and this becomes 360 miles long. April 15th, 1818, Nathaniel Macon writes to Bartlett Yancey, quote, "If Congress can make canals, they can with more propriety emancipate." So they let the cat out of the bag. That's really what's going on. They can take your slaves away. They can build canals. They have all this power. This is the Confederate. This is the Richmond Cabal. 1819, you have McCulloch versus Maryland. This is a really important decision of the Marshall Court, which says that the state of Maryland cannot tax the National Bank, and that the National Bank is constitutional. That I don't have time to read the quotes, but he uses the same arguments as Hamilton to say anything that is necessary for something which is constitutional is constitutional. So you have Congress, now here, this is interesting. April of 1822, Congress approved $6,000 for the construction of the National Road. Monroe vetoes it. He says, nope, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can do this. So he's pushing for development, but it's all the states, because the Erie Canal was done only with state bonds. New York floated state bonds to build it. The road was being built by the states, but when the federal government steps in and says, here's $6,000 for the road, he vetoes it. And this is this ghost haunting him, right, from Virginia, from this legacy. He asks the Supreme Court for an opinion on the General Welfare Clause allowing for federal money for certain internal improvements. And in the one and only case ever in the history of the United States, the Supreme Court gives a decision not based on a trial. And the paper is written by Jefferson's old friend, Justice William Johnson. And William Johnson says, you know what? Absolutely, internal improvements are constitutional. Absolutely. So this is really incredible. And then 1823, you have the Monroe Doctrine delivered by Monroe, where he defends the sovereignty of our Latin American brothers from the European colonial powers.
That's the Monroe Doctrine.
The Monroe Doctrine, which, you know, people say, I'm sure John Quincy Adams played a large role in writing this, but Monroe in his own right was for this. I mean, he understood as well as John Quincy Adams the necessity of this. And February 1824, Gibbons versus Ogden. This is where Ogden ran a steamship company and he'd been given a monopoly on the Hudson River. And so they wouldn't let Gibbons run his ships up the Hudson River. So the Supreme Court says, no, absolutely not. This is Article 1, Section 8, says that the Congress can regulate commerce between the states. States' rights does not apply here. The General Survey Act was then passed by the U.S. Congress in April of 1824, coming off of this Gibbons versus Ogden, which authorized the president to have surveys made of routes for transport, roads, and canals of national importance in a commercial or military point of view, or necessary for the transportation of public mail. While such infrastructure of national scope had been discussed and shown wanting for years, its passage shortly followed the landmark Supreme Court decision Gibbons versus Ogden, which first established federal authority over interstate commerce. The president assigned responsibility to for the surveys to the Army Corps of Engineers. Monroe signs the General Survey Act and National Road into law. John Quincy Adams rejoices. Rejoice that if for you there are neither rocky mountains nor oasis of the desert, from the rivers of the Southern Ocean to the shores of the Atlantic Sea. Rejoice that if for you the waters of the Columbia mingle in union with the streams of the Delaware, the lakes of the St. Lawrence and the floods of the Mississippi. Rejoice that if for you every valley has been exalted and every mountain and hill has been made low, the crooked straight and the rough places plain. And he goes on like this. You are under God indebted for the enjoyment of all these unspeakable blessings. The change, more than any other man, living or dead, was the work of James Monroe. So that's John Quincy Adams, who, right, he becomes the next president. And what he does is he takes that General Survey Act and he runs with it. And all of these canals, they're not all built right away, but they're all laid out. And it's all, the Army Corps of Engineers goes wild. They're everywhere. One engineer, you know, the same engineers that are up at the Erie Canal 1 minute, they're down in New Jersey a year later, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to end with a short, in 1825, I just want to say, Lafayette, our dear friend, who's with us from the time of the Revolution, he comes back to the United States. And this is right before the election of 1824, which unfortunately becomes very contentious. The spirit of nonpartisanship of Monroe quickly ends, and you have the Confederates like Crawford running, Andrew Jackson is running, and there's an intervention made. It's too detailed to go into right now, but the election is very contentious, and it goes to the Congress, and the Congress votes for John Quincy Adams to become president. And it's constitutional, but it's contentious. And Lafayette was one of the key people who came over, and he revitalized that spirit of the American Revolution, which was critical in getting JQA elected as president. On August 6th, Lafayette and President John Quincy Adams left for Oak Hill, which was Marshall's estate. After reaching the Potomac and paying the bridge toll, they started for another bank, only to stop abruptly when they heard shouts of, "Mr. President, Mr. President." The frantic toll collector appeared, gasping, "Mr. President, you have given me 11 cents too little." When they finally reached Oak Hill the following day, Chief Justice John Marshall joined them and Monroe at a dinner hosted by the local citizenry. After a toast that recognized Marshall as, quote, the soldier, the statesman, the jurist, the Chief Justice stood to announce that he would make a few toasts of his own. He raised first his glass to Lafayette as, quote, the one who relinquished all the pleasures and enjoyments which Europe could furnish to encounter the dangers in our struggle for independence. He then turned to his lifelong friend Monroe, whom he truly loved. "I am proud to recognize one of my earliest associates, one with whom I have frequently acted in the most trying scenes, for whom I have felt and still retain the most affectionate and respected esteem, without a taint of that bitter spirit which has been too long the scourge of our country." Monroe was deeply touched and told Marshall, quote, "We began our career together in early youth, and the whole course of my public conduct has been under your observation. Your approbation, therefore, of my administration in the affairs of our country deserves to be held, and will be held by me, in the highest estimation." So that's what I have. So my name is Chris Sare, and I'm going to present something today that I've been thinking about for a long time. And it was a 3-hour class, which I was told to condense down to an hour and a half. So I'll try to get at the most important, relevant points. Some details, but more conceptual. And if you think about what you just heard, and what we're doing now, that this is the fulfillment of the American Revolution. This now spreading throughout the world is exactly what the United States was founded to create in the first place. And starting with Cusa, who wrote in 1433, "Hence, since natural law is based on reason, all law is rooted by nature in the reason of man. The wiser and more outstanding men are chosen as rulers by the others to draw up just laws by the clear reason, wisdom, and prudence given to them by nature, and to rule the others by these laws, and to decide controversies for the maintenance of peace. From this we conclude that those better endowed with reason are the natural lords and masters of the others, but not by any coercive law or judgment imposed on someone against his will. For since all are by nature free, every governance, whether it consists in a written law or in a living law in the person of a prince, can only come from the agreement and consent of the subjects. For if men are by nature equal in power and equally free, the true, properly ordered authority of one common ruler who is their equal in power, can only be constituted by the election and the consent of the others. And law is also established by consent." This is in 1433. Where was he going to create that idea? In Europe in 1433. It wasn't going to happen. He says, For those who live by the law are free, but true law is righteousness. True law is not carved on tablets nor cut in bronze, but stamped on the mind and imprinted on the senses. Now that's an important thing, because the evil of the empire is a philosophical evil. And the idea of, as Stephanie did a class a couple weeks back, where she went through this question of Leibniz versus Locke. And what Locke says in his essays on human understanding, let's see if I can, how do I go to the next slide? He says on the Fairfax estate together. Lord Fairfax was I'm going to show you the whole idea of the northern neck of the Fairfax grant. And this is a whole story in and of itself, but Graham Lowry's book goes through this in great detail, that the idea of this Fairfax grant and the fight to recognize that it was the head of the springs of the Potomac and the Rappahannock rivers that represented the Fairfax estate, and that what this did was this put you on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. And so if you were interested in developing the interior of the United States, this was absolutely critical. And so Washington and Thomas Marshall, John Marshall's father, worked together on surveying this whole area, just to give you a sense of where John Marshall comes from. As a young man, John Marshall grew up around the Fairfax estate and had access to his entire library, including Jonathan Swift, all of these, and you know from Graham's book that these were the circles, these were the Leibnizian circles in Europe, that he didn't just come out of nowhere. You had James Monroe, who was born in the very same region. Now I'm going to look at both Marshall and Monroe very closely in the course of this class, because there's an irony, there's a huge irony if you look at the lives of these two men together, and you'll see what I mean. There's another man who's very important, Matthew Carey, who will become an important part of this story. And he's recruited by Benjamin Franklin. He's from Ireland. He's recruited by Benjamin Franklin in Europe to come to the United States. First he goes back to Ireland and he sets up Republican networks in Ireland against the British. But when it becomes unsafe, he comes to the United States. And he sets up shop in Philadelphia as a printer, very much like Ben Franklin himself. The whole issue of Europe and the oligarchical system and the philosophy behind, say, Locke, was critical, so that the idea was to keep the United States and keep the colonies as a backward agrarian society, and to make sure that there was no industrial development whatsoever. Now, you had the Stamp Act in 1765. Franklin goes over to Europe and he fights he actually organizes England to repeal this. But in the meantime, Washington shifts his entire plantation away from tobacco, which was a cash crop that he would ship the tobacco. That the mind is a tabula rasa, that there's no principles governing, that basically what you know is what you experience. And what you experience is, like an animal, you seek pleasure, you avoid pain. Leibniz says quite the opposite. He says that there are principles that are established already in your soul, in your mind. And he says people that follow Locke, quote, will be capable for their pleasure or advancement of setting on fire the four corners of the earth. Boldly they scoff at the love of country. They ridicule those who care for the public. And when any well-meaning man speaks of what will become of posterity, they reply, we shall see when the time comes. But these persons will possibly experience themselves the evils they think reserved for others. If, however, this disease of an epidemic mind whose bad effects begin to be visible is corrected, these evils will perhaps be prevented. But if it goes on increasing, Providence will correct men by the revolution itself, which must spring therefrom. And that's the American Revolution. Now, I want to, wish that I could, let's see here. There we go. This little county here, Westmoreland County, is an important little place. This is where George Washington was born. This is the area where Monroe comes from. This is where a lot of the founding fathers from Virginia come from. And at the time, when Alexander Spotswood was governor of Virginia, he was fighting against an oligarchical system. You had large plantations there, lots of slaves on these plantations, and an agricultural, turn that off, and an agricultural backwardness of plantation that was the British system that they had set up. Now, what Spotswood did was he organized an iron industry in Germania, and he knew that in order for the colonies to become free, you would have to develop a manufacturing base, science, progress. He made Ben Franklin the postmaster of Philadelphia, for example. So there was a direct tie between over to Europe and get finished goods back from Europe. And at a certain point he realized this was, you kept getting worse and worse goods, a worse and worse price for the tobacco. So he shifts his entire plantation to producing wheat and corn and other goods, and then he sells these to bakeries in Alexandria. And when he becomes president later, he prides himself in wearing, everything he's wearing when he becomes president was made in the United States. Everything, down to his belt buckle. And so this gives you a sense of the difference between, for example, him and Thomas Jefferson, which we'll get to. James Monroe and, no, I actually want to show you this. The 1763, the French and Indian War is over, and this is the proclamation line of 1763 that the British impose on the colonies. And so that's the line, and the colonies cannot go any further west than that. And what the Indian Reserve, that's what the British organize an Indian Reserve. They say, just this area is just going to be for the Indians, no development to the west. So if you're George Washington and you've been organizing the Ohio Company and you want to develop this whole area, this has now shut everything off. Now by 1770, Washington is organizing trips into this area anyway. He risks everything. He goes and does tours and looks at the question of canals and this kind of thing. The American Revolution intervenes in the meantime, and this is William and Mary College. This is where James Monroe used to do, starting in 1775, he did drills. He organized drills of the militia in Virginia, so that when George Washington became the commander-in-chief up in Boston, He was organizing, he and his father, Spence Monroe, and John Marshall, and his father, Thomas Marshall, they were organizing the regiments from Virginia to go up to Boston to join with General Washington. And these people, they fought in the Revolution. Monroe fought in the Revolution. Marshall fought in the Revolution. James Monroe was he was in the battle at Trenton. In fact, that's him. He was one of the only casualties in the Battle of Trenton. He was wounded gravely, and he, of course, he survived. Yeah, he becomes president, so he's all right. But but it's so he fought. He was in it. John Marshall also, Spotswood and Franklin. Franklin in 1743, just to give you a sense of it, because this is, when you think of the founding fathers, and I'm going to get into this battle between those who were with the British system, even people who considered themselves patriots, or who you would consider to be a patriot, like Thomas Jefferson, for example. Say, oh, he was a patriot. In fact, many people really prize Jefferson because he's against the power of the government. He protects the states. He protects the little guy, he says. Now, in this pamphlet, A Proposal for Promoting Useful Knowledge Among the British Plantations in America, Franklin says, the first drudgery of settling new colonies which confines the attention of people to mere necessities are now pretty well over. And there are many in every province in circumstances that set them at ease and afford leisure to cultivate the finer arts and improve the common stock of knowledge. To such of these who are men of speculation, many hints must from time to time arise, many observations occur, which if well examined, pursued, and improved, might produce discoveries to the advantage of some or all of the British plantations, or to the benefit of mankind in general. 1743. We don't have a nation yet. That the subjects of the correspondence within this society that he creates be new and useful improvements in any branch of mathematics, new discoveries in chemistry, such as improvements in distillation, brewing, he was a big fan of beer, or assaying of ores, new mechanical inventions for saving labor, as mills and carriages, and for raising and conveying of water, draining of meadows, all new arts, trades, and manufactures that may be proposed or thought of, surveys, maps, and charts of particular parts of the seacoast or inland countries, course and junction of rivers and great roads, situation of lakes and mountains, nature of the soil and productions, new methods of improving the breed of useful animals, introducing other sorts from foreign countries, new improvements in planting, gardening, and clearing land, and all philosophical experiments that let light into the nature of things, tend to increase the power of man over matter and multiply the pleasures and conveniences of life. So he lays this all out in 1743. What will be the American system of political economy that develops? So, as a young man, George Washington was a surveyor. And he was a surveyor with a man named Thomas Marshall. And they worked actually on